I don't know if you noticed, but in one of your interviews that I listened to, you said I choreographed the audience. And I was like, that's so right. That is so like it's not the user experience. It's not whatever. It's like you are thinking like a dancer, it feels like. When it comes to have you seen that apply to your work? What about journalism? Does it have the same kind of impact?
Yeah, very much so. I think what was great about going to school for journalism is that I really learned about how people's stories can feel like fiction, real life people's stories. That was really the focus in my journalism class was literary journalism. And so, thinking about how real world stories can feel so immersive, like narrative, mythology or fantasy or sci-fi work, made me realize that there was real potential with immersing people in real life stories, immersing people into your neighbor's story or immersing people into the story of the houseless person down the street. Like that is actually a very compelling way of approaching storytelling. It doesn't always have to be this like Disney-fied call to hero's journey sort of narrative, which I also love. And so when I took that piece of journalism and sort of the backbone of that journalism, which was feeling more like fiction, and then I added the backbone of this person who grew up trying everything and anything without there being a lot of preciousness to what happened to it, really I think is what brings this part of me that is very experiential, where I like love putting people into experiences. Like even as a kid growing up with six kids, being the oldest, I would love hosting my brothers and sisters birthday parties, and I was always thinking about the theme and the experience and the invitations and the scavenger hunt and how did the piñata connect with the other thing, and how did we make it feel like a nice flow of an experience for these kids who are coming to enjoy a birthday party, right? But like applying that to nonfiction storytelling, and then on top of that being immersed in a Disney quality experience where you're seeing how Disney Cruise Line moves people throughout the ship, you're seeing the incredible entertainment, you're seeing the way the guest services take care of the guests, then leaving that and going to Disneyland and Legoland and SeaWorld and seeing that on scale with theme parks, you have to realize there's like all these like deep influences in my life, and I'm like, oh, of course I would just suddenly fall in love with virtual reality and start making nonfiction stories using virtual reality. But it doesn't always click, I think, as very obvious to other people who are like, it doesn't make sense. How did you go from studying literary journalism to suddenly doing virtual reality experiences?
Yeah, no, I think I relate because it's my background's in television. And so it's like when I tried it, I went, oh, I see this. I see how this all works together. But I like the movement, like the bringing of the movement and the bringing of the storytelling. You offer such a wonderful perspective. So one of the things that at least when I remember meeting you, generally, I think I've met you a few times, and you are very physical, which makes sense. You're a dancer, and you just have this like wonderful energy about you that's so accepting and appreciative of those around you, and it's so amazing. And yet there's a part of you that's also very like, as I've gotten to know you and I've gotten to know your story and try that has this sort of loss that you've had in your life, but you still have hope. Like it's this like balance. It's like the dark and the light. And even if you're telling these stories that can come across as, so tragic, but then you still have the lightness with there. And it feels like recently you've even gotten more and more personal with your work. And I'm hoping that for those of you who haven't seen any of Michaela's work, that you could talk just a little bit, however comfortable you are, with that kind of moving into the more personal end of things.
Yeah, of course. Look, I worked for big entertainment companies, like I said, Disney Cruise Line, Disneyland, Legoland, SeaWorld. It was so easy to just become a part of the show and be a dancer and performer. But when I really started making my own work, especially when I moved to New York City and started working for Time Magazine, I still felt like I was performing at a theme park because I was still working for this big brand, Time Magazine. They had very specific things that they would do and wouldn't do, whether that was space related, whether that was related to a national park or a solar eclipse or a movie set. But there were things that I was forming as my own voice within that realm that I was like, oh, if it were up to me, I would actually be more focused on this, or I would be more focused on this. And so once I decided to move on from Time Magazine, I realized the biggest thing that was restraining me in journalism was the journalistic voice of having to be unbiased. And so I started leaning into doing more social impact work where I could say, here's the call to action. Like, here's the thing that we can do to make the world better. Let's not just be presenting interesting ideas or interesting facts for people. Let's actually say, like, hey, there's this place in the middle of this area that needs support for better education, or there's this issue that you might not even be aware of, but you can get involved, or you can at least be educated about it. Like, because I am a dancer, there was a part of me that was like, oh, I want people to be active, not just in the immersion of seeing the story, whether that's VR or AR or whatever, but also in the activity after, like the transformative experience of having them actually change their behavior or change their mindset. That's an active form of being a part of media participation. And I wanted people to feel that way. And so I started doing a lot of social impact work. I even did my own documentary about gun violence and survival. And there's a very pure part of me that's very comfortable hiding behind the work and being like, I get to bring this person's story to the forefront. Isn't that so cool? Like, I get to be a part of this and I don't take any of the credit for it. And I feel very comfortable doing that. And again, I think that comes back to the oldest of 6 kids. But the rubber really hit the road when I started doing narrative work. And so Reimagined was this VR anthology series that's all female directed, female led, female produced. I was the director and the writer of the second volume, and it's all about reimagining folk tales and fairy tales and mythologies. And so I remember saying, I want to do Filipino mythology and I want to do a story about compromise amongst siblings. And very quickly, my executive producers at Meta were like, this isn't reading. This doesn't feel powerful enough. It doesn't seem like you really understand this topic. And I'm like, I, as an older sibling, totally understand the topic of compromise, but very much so what happens is like it just doesn't read to the rest of the audience. And that doesn't mean it's not the right theme or topic for you to discuss. It just might not be the right time for you to discuss it, or might not be the right story or the right way for you to discuss it. And so I was very stubborn about it. I was like, no, like, we're going to make this work. We're going to make this work. And it became very apparent to me that the best way to make it work was to not talk about compromise and to talk about grief. And originally, I had this father character in Mahal that was teaching his kids this lesson of compromise. And very quickly, I realized I was like, I have to kill the father character and I have to make this a story about grief. Like, that's what was coming up for me. Right. And I was so resistant to it as I even knew I needed to do it. As I was getting these notes from Meta, as Meta was telling me they were even thinking about pulling the project at one point, like, I knew this was the direction I needed to go. And so, I buckled in. I was like, all right, let me dive into this grief that I've processed it in therapy, but I've never processed it in my own art. And so that was really powerful for Mahal to be this like homage, not just to my mother who's Filipino American, but also to my father who passed away. And then very shortly after Mahal, a year later, Tribeca approached me and said, hey, we want you to do a short film using generative AI in 3 weeks. And I was like, wow, 3 weeks. And the day they asked me to do it was the 30th anniversary of my father passing. And I remember my mom and I had this really deep conversation about my father and about her and about me and our relationship that I never really felt. She told me all these things that her and my father had planned for me and how they had were so excited for me to come. And these are just things I hadn't heard ever be based on just the loss and grief that my mom went through very early on in my life. And so I realized I was like, you know what, this conversation for this generative AI film, especially because during that year I had actually also really repaired and healed my relationship with my stepfather. I was like, this is going to be an homage to my mom. This is going to be an homage to her rebuilding our lives, getting remarried, making the best choices she thought she could make, talking about grief, reflecting on what that is. And so the 3-minute short film, Thank You, Mom, is really that. It's like journal entries that are inspired by my own journal entries from the time I was a young girl, teenager, and now an adult. And really from this lens of this young girl realizing she got everything she wanted, right? She got the dad, she got the brother, she got the mom, but it wasn't necessarily what she needed. What she needed was this radical love and acceptance of her mother and what her mother was trying to do for her in her life, which was just about her, the girl, accepting herself, which has been the journey I've been on the last few years. So Thank You Mom is very personal in that way. And now what's really crazy that's come around is this Museum of the Moving Image exhibition. So again, the 30th anniversary of my father's death is this year, and him and one of his mentees who he mentored through skate filmmaking and mentored as a skateboard company owner and I have been talking to each other. We've been in relationship since I was 18, just to be able to connect to my father and who he was, and he feels gratification to be able to like be a part of my life and like be connected to me. And we were like, how do we honor my father's legacy? And we thought about putting my father's work into the Library of Congress, but in order to do that, you have to screen them at a museum. And I had worked with the Museum of the Moving Image before. And I approached them. I said, hey, I don't tell many people this, but my dad was a very renowned skate filmmaker. Here are his seminal works that he did. I would love to be able to discuss screening his work at the Museum of the Moving Image so we can kind of think about his lasting legacy at the Library of Congress. And they were like, we're not just going to screen your father's works. Like, we think skate filmmaking is perfect for the Museum of the Moving Image. Let's create an exhibit. Let's highlight your dad in the exhibit. The opening reception of the exhibit will be your father's film, and you get to talk on a panel about your father. And like this all just happened a few weeks, like last week, last Saturday. And so it's just this huge moment of saying, okay, now I'm not even just using my grief or my mom's story or our story as this like inspiration for creative work. Now it's come down to like the meat and potatoes of actually saying, this is who my father was. Like, this is who Michael Ternasky was. This was the work he had. This was me. Like, I think about myself even like if someone made a museum exhibit highlighting my work after I've passed, like that would be a huge honor and a huge joy. And so the fact I can give that gift to my father and then also be able to come out and be like, this is my story about my father, this is the story about who he was, is sort of feels like this like baptism as the 30th year of my life begins in this new decade. And so that's really been my journey to make personal stories. It's been this like slow immersion down, and now the irony is I'm exactly back where I started, where I'm telling real world stories about real world people, but I'm not using other people as the collaborators and inspiration point. Like now I am the like subject
Right.
matter
Which is
material and
part of
inspiration
part.
point.
I mean, that's kind of, I guess, why I wanted to have you, because I feel like you are such a lovely, wonderful, vulnerable person in person. And then now like the world kind of gets to see that and pull in all your sort of creative abilities to like show and have people have these kind of amazing experiences. I guess that's why I was like, I feel like you're at the beginning, that there's something, years from now or a year from now that will be like, oh, did you see what Michaela made now? Like it just is, they're so universal, but also so specific, which I think is really powerful.